Hello, my name is Roland, and this is a tutorial video on how to make an installation melter in Auction Not Included from scratch in survival. I am going to assume if you're looking up information on this, you have a basic understanding of how the mechanics of the game works, and are looking for either a way to accrue more tungsten, or from what I presume is the case, you want to build something that's over the top, which this is definitely what you're looking for. I'm going to be breaking down this video into 3 parts for the sake of saving time, as this video will be, I would assume, fairly long. First part will be how to melt the insulation and the mechanics that allow it. The second part will be how to build it and warm it up. And the third part will be how to maintain and run this current build. If you understand what I'm about to explain, you can just skip to the timestamp, which I'll put down below. And without further delay, let's start. Insulation acquired from the molecular forge can be melted, and when it does, it becomes liquid tungsten instead of the liquid variant of that material. This is particularly handy on maps that do not have a lot of cold biomes, or in some cases no cold biomes at all, such as Oasis. The caveat, however, is that the current build I have displayed does require a small amount of tungsten, and there really isn't a way around that. If you do not have a cold biome, nor do you have a glittering planet within your star system, then this build I'm showing cannot be done without making a small temporary version to acquire the tungsten that is needed to do this. You can set up a catch basin style that I'll show over here. Disclaimer, this is a proof of concept and is in no way set up in a way to be efficient. This is built to show how to make a melter without tungsten. It's not refined in any way. I will leave the save file for this in the description below, just so people can actually go into this map and see what's going on, and I really encourage that as well. We are using 2 in-game mechanics to do this. One of them has been disclaimed by Clay as an intended mechanic. The other one may or may not be considered an exploit. However, it's been in the game for quite a while now, so I'm going to presume that it is an intended mechanic. And the 2 mechanics I'm talking about are throttling liquids from 10 kilogram to 1 kilogram packets and tricking pumps into pumping liquids that aren't in contact with the pump. If you do not approve of the latter mechanic, of the pump mechanic here, you're free to drop a tungsten pump down into this liquid and extract it. It will pump a little bit before it overheats. However, the reason I opt for this method here is just for simplicity's sake, and it's a level of maintenance I don't have to do, and I can also automate the process as well. If you do not approve of it, you can just pop a tungsten pump down and continually deconstruct it and reconstruct it to pump in liquids if you wish. So the materials required for the current build I am displaying here requires a large amount of insulation, some diamond, and a bit of tungsten. The exact amounts are as following. You need 86 tons of insulation, you need 20 tons of diamond, and 4,700 kilograms of tungsten. This is not a mid-game or even really an end-game build. This is a very, very late end-game build that requires a fair amount of preparation time to set up, and it requires a very large amount of insulation, which is also, I know, is a hard material to acquire as well. However, you can alter this if you wish. If you wish to make it more compact, if you wish to make it not as big, you can adjust it so you use less insulation. The principles, I will teach you the principles. They stay the same throughout. It doesn't really change. The medium used to melt the insulation can be one of 2 types. You can either choose for niobium, or you can also use steel. Both come with advantages and disadvantages, respectively. Niobium is the go-to material due to its very high evaporation point of 4,743 degrees Celsius, allowing a lot of play in recipes you can use, which will be discussed later on. However, the advantages stop there, really, because niobium also has a low heat capacity of 0.265, so its temperature fluctuates quite dramatically, thus needing more mass to help prevent that. Steel, on the other hand, is very weird. In its solid state, it melts at 2,426. However, due to its once it is a liquid, it freezes at 1,083 and has an evaporation point of 3,826. This is a 2,743 degree difference, which is immensely useful in preventing pipes from cracking due to freezing or evaporating. On top of that, liquid steel sees a conductivity increase of 80, which helps transfer heat to the pipe that we are melting. It has a slightly higher heat capacity of 0.386. Helps in some sense, but it actually works against itself, reducing the recipes you can use. Again, this will be discussed later on. Both of the mediums to choose from have a very low heat capacity, and thus need help to alleviate that problem. The solution is mass. The more mass, the less the temperature fluctuates, allowing control in the margins of temperature. Where the mass comes into play is after the medium comes in contact with the insulation we are exchanging heat with. The temperature of the medium will also be well below its freezing point and will crack the pipes once it merges back into packets larger than 1 kilogram. However, if we have a large heat sink with a lot of mass with stored up heat that can warm the medium back up above its freezing point, it will prevent the problem from ever occurring. The material that the heat sink has to be made out of has to be able to withstand the temperatures that we're dealing with, and is also somewhat conductive. The two choices you can make the tiles that fit that criteria is either diamond window tiles or tungsten metal tiles. While both can work, I strongly suggest diamond, as it is easier to acquire a large amount compared to tungsten and has a higher melting point, a larger heat capacity, and overall better conductivity. While the heat sink is designed to store heat, it cannot get too hot, as the lowest melting point in contact with the heat sink will eventually hit that point and destroy the system. The weak point is tungsten, as I'll show here. Tungsten's melting point is 3,421 degrees Celsius, so to prevent that from happening, I have some automation that will prevent the refineries from working at all, preventing the tungsten in the slab from melting. The automation I have set up is fairly simple and mainly acts as a high and low temperature sensor for the heatsink. The high temperature limit sensor is set to around 3,200 degrees Celsius on the steel loop. However, you can go a little bit higher with the niobium. That is to allow a buffer for tungsten's melting point. It's also to allow AFK play, or just set it and forget it and not worry about this entire system turning into a bomb. The low temperature sensor depends on what type of medium you choose. If you choose niobium, then I set it up around 2,600 degrees. This allows a nice buffer between that and the freezing point in niobium. Steel, on the other hand, is very unlikely to freeze. However, I still set it up at around 1,200 degrees for redundancy's sake. The automation is for refineries is simple. It's just 2 AND gates and a NOT gate set up in this orientation. The low temperature sensor is to flip the refineries back and forth if the heatsink was ever to get too cold. It's designed more for niobium in mind, as it's not really designed for steel, as again, steel probably won't get to that temperature. The high limit is designed to flip both of them off. So it's just there to shut the entire system off to prevent it from turning into a bomb. And that's really it. The high limit also has a NOT that flips on this bypass loop. This loop is to, how do you describe it? When you put the insulation into these chunks here, they're going to be at 20 degrees or whatever you made the insulation temperature at. So here, I can just show it. I'll show you exactly why I have this loop here. So you can see, you come in, and this bypass is now, instead of using the refinery to heat up this loop, it's going to take the heat from the heatsink and bring it back until it's satisfied. This is so the refineries can turn back on, but it's more importantly, it's to prevent the temperature of the liquid, particularly steel in this case, from evaporating into a gas, which I will describe later on about recipes. The second part of the system over here is for the tanks to buffer the refineries and the refinery room itself. The most important part of the setup is that the tiles below both the tanks and refineries. So when we go into minerals here, this most center tile of refineries has to be made out of insulation, and I believe it's the left tile. I put both down because I'm paranoid that way, but I believe it's the left tile of the tank that will interact with that has to be made out of insulation, or in these tanks cases, since they're in a vacuum, you can actually put an airflow or a mesh tile below, as it won't exchange heat with it in a vacuum. The shutoffs I have are just in case I want to decommission the system for whatever reason and are not required. And there are 2 refineries, one for the steel loop and one for the loop of your medium of choice. The steel loop is designed more for niobium in mind due to niobium's freezing point. However, its main purpose is to warm up the heat sink when you're starting up the system. Once this system is above the temperature that it needs to be, it now acts as both a backup in case the heat sink gets too cool, and it also increases the mass of the system by rotating this liquid steel through it, which will interact with it whenever the heat sink either gets too cool or too warm. The recipes you can use for this build actually do matter, depending on which design you went for. The reasoning for that is the medium we choose, that is upstream of the insulation we are melting, has to be hotter than the melting point of insulation before it interacts with it. But it has to be below the melting point of tungsten downstream of it when it interacts with the heatsink. So it is a bit of a balancing act. Gold cannot be used, period, because it produces such a little amount of heat difference in any medium you choose. Do not use gold whatsoever. The recipes that go from least amount of energy injected to the most is as follows: gold, copper, wolframite, aluminum, thermium to niobium, and then iron ore and pyrite are the same, with steel injecting the most amount of heat. Niobium loops are the most finicky to set up due to niobium's freezing point. However, once it's set up, it's essentially foolproof, as you will not get anywhere near the evaporation point of niobium before the tungsten loops melt. You cannot use gold, obviously, as stated earlier. You can use wolframite and copper. However, you need to tweak the high limit sensor here to be a little bit below the melting point of tungsten to allow for that, due to the amount of energy that wolframite and copper injected to niobium is pretty close to getting in between the melting point of insulation and tungsten. Steel actually has really good properties. I actually prefer it now as my medium of choice, as when it liquefies, it actually sees a heat capacity. I don't think there's a difference in heat capacity, but I know it has a thermal conductivity increase. And steel itself, because of its crazy temperature fluctuation allowance, it has a lot of useful properties. However, there's one big drawback with steel. Steel can only be used with steel recipes. The amount of thermal energy injected into steel is 606. You can technically use iron and pyrite respectively, because they have a 347 degree difference. The reason you cannot do both is steel's evaporation point at 3826. So as you can see right now, the slab's around 3000 degrees ish, and its high limit's around 3200, because if it was to be anything higher than that, the amount of heat injected by the steel recipe has a very real possibility of flashing that steel into a gas. So if you were to use iron ore and pyrite along with steel, there's a really good chance that this will get way too hot and it'll actually allow steel over, like, say 3300 degrees into the refinery and will destroy the entire system. So you can do one or the other. You can't do both. Out of the two materials I have suggested, I prefer steel, because I know it's going to be harder to accrue about 10 tons of niobium compared to getting 10 tons of steel, considering that a lot of the recipes, and the recipe that I advise is steel recipes, will just make this process even easier if you use steel as the medium of choice. A lot of this build's pretty self-evident when you look at it. Like, it's all in a vacuum, obviously. I don't think I need to explain that. All the insulated pipe must be made out of insulation, for, again, obvious reasons. The ladders also have to be made out of insulation, due to that when these pipes liquefy, they are liquid tungsten temporarily, and they will exchange heat with the ladders. The ladders are required to acquire the tungsten, obviously, otherwise the dupes won't be able to get this. I can't really think of much more I can really do to describe the system. I think that's a pretty thorough description of it all. I hope this gives you a pretty good grasp of all the mechanics involved and the concepts that we're using and why some things are the way that they are. I will be moving on now to the second part of the video, where we're going to be building this from scratch in debug. Alright, so I have a shell of the build. I prefer to do this instead of building everything inside, because making a vacuum inside of here is much easier when there isn't any obstruction slowing the gases. Once a vacuum is created, then you can proceed to build the rest. So one of the ways to warm up the heatsink quickly to get above the freezing point of liquid steel is I set up this little temporary loop over here. All it is just a tank and a vacuum on mesh tiles with a shutoff below to a valve that again throttles it down to 1 kilogram per second packets. This is for when you want to pump, say, magma, or if you're using a glass forge, liquid glass in here to help warm this up. So before you close this in, when you build this system, you want to have a dupe come here and set that to 1,000 kilograms per second. Once that's done, you can close off the rest. Or, if you want to, you can make this one tile longer if you wish. It's up to you. So there is a multiple amount of methods on how to warm up the heatsink here. This is what's going to take the most amount of time. The following methods are: you could pump magma through the loop I built here. You could also use a glass forge to put liquid glass through. You can use pitcher pumps and put a bottle empty here, right here, and leave this as a vacuum. And you can also, if you really want to, you could use a hydrogen rocket above it. Out of the 4 methods mentioned, I will be doing magma for this particular build. However, my preference in survival is a glass forge, as this is something I somewhat start early in preparing and let it warm up while I focus on something else. However, if speed is the essence, hydrogen rockets are the way to go, because of the temperature of the rockets is immensely high. Well, I haven't tested it myself. I've seen proof of concept on it on Reddit, but it probably will get this up to temperature in 1 to 2 launches if you wish to do that. So this is how I prefer to get my loop set up. And I didn't make this out of anything exotic. This is just igneous rock. It's going all the way up into the tank here, and it's going to go through here and drop out here. The liquid vent has to be made out of either niobium or steel, depending on the medium that you choose, because it will melt, and you can't make liquid vents out of any refined metal like tungsten or something like that. So be aware of that. Anyways, I'm going to let this set up. I'm going to count the amount of cycles. We're at 57. Everything's set at around 20 degrees, so this should be a good basis. So while that's warming up, I'm going to show you a base outline of how to set up to melt steel. I will not be melting steel in this video for time's sake, but this does work. If you place kilns made out of steel, as you can see here, they're made out of steel, in a vacuum, they will not exchange any temperature on mesh tiles, by the way, cannot be airflow tiles. They will not exchange temperature with anything, and they will eventually heat up if you put continuous recipes on, to the point where it will melt. And that's how you acquire liquid steel. And because when liquid steel melts, it's at 2400 degrees, it will interact with the tiles a little bit, but it will still be a liquid when it comes down. You can set this up below the melter while it is melting, while the magma is heating up, or whatever method you're using to heat up the heat sink. You can have this set up underneath and cooking away, because it will take quite a bit of coal if you're doing the refined carbon route, or ceramic if you have some lying around. You should have a lot of coal built up at this point, because you probably have been farming the carbon asteroids that have nothing but coal and diamond for the diamond. And that's more or less how you can make liquid steel. You can make liquid steel using different methods as well, such as rockets if you want to. I won't be showing any of that. Again, for time's sake, I will be linking what I can find on Reddit in the description below. So the heat sinks around above 1100 degrees now. One of the things you have to be aware of is these liquid bridges inside of here. Since they're made out of insulation, they will interact, but they have a monstrously huge heat capacity. So they will slowly take heat out of the heat sink, even though you think it's around temperature. So once the bridges themselves are above or close to the temperature that you want, you can now shut off the loop like I did. It's just draining the rest of this. And that didn't take actually that long. We started at 57 cycles. So when you think about it, that actually took not a lot of time at all to get this to this point. And from here on, it's a lot of hands off once we get the steel in here. So I'm going to simulate, this is what I would do in a survival playthrough on how to acquire liquid steel. I would have a couple kilns and just melted them. This is about 6 kilns worth of liquid steel we're going to inject into the loop. And once that's in the metal refinery, we're going to continuously produce steel just for time of sake. You can do any recipe you want, honestly, at this point. You can use gold even to warm up this heat sink here. And once this gets up to the temperature that we require, which is going to be around 2600 for this, because I will be using steel as my medium of choice for this particular build, then we will move on to the third phase of warming up. Alright, so once the heat sink is above, Give it a sec, it's auto-saving. Once the heatsink is above 2500, around there, you can slowly begin introducing the medium that you're going to be using. I highly advise you don't go more than, say, 500 kilograms to a ton each time, because if you were to put, let's say, 10 tons in right now, when it liquefies, there's a chance it might spill over. It's very low, but the main issue is it'll take too much heat out of the heatsink, and there's a real possibility you might freeze the steel loop. So go one, like, just small chunks at a time. You don't really have to baby it too much at this point. Once you get a liquid in here, the sensor will trip. I'll come back once this has all been a liquid and we can actually start pumping the medium into the primary loop here. Oh yeah, one little thing before I put that in. So it took almost 9 tons of steel, or 90 steel recipes, to get this up and running. Just as a little, just so you know. So we're at cycle 95, or getting close near the end of it. We have successfully melted around 11 tons of steel, give or take a bit. In order, because liquid metals have a bit of viscosity to them, in order for me to get a nice level amount of liquid here for the medium, I actually took a automatic dispenser and essentially did this, made out of steel, by the way, and then prioritize them to come across the ladders over here and drop the steel. It was just because I wasn't getting enough over here for the pump. Afterwards, you can just do this with it, and it'll just add to the pool. So this should be good to go to start pumping anyways. And I will clip back once this is ready to show the initial stage of this melting stuff. So as you can see here, this is the first craft coming out at 2965, and then as it interacts, it drops all the way to what the temperature of the installation is currently at, which is around 700. So the packets come together, they merge together with the bridges, and they come out as 10 kilogram packets. And this will continue on, loop, 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 until it melts, and then it will go and it will keep working after it melts with the bypass loop here until the heatsink gets to the temperature that we selected for the high sensor, or if you build insulation pipe again before that happens. This more or less concludes the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. It's my first video, so if there's a lot of ums and stuff like that, I apologize. I'd like to thank Francis for showing my earlier concept of the installation melter about, let's say, 8 months ago, somewhere around there, sometime in June. That's when I made that. This is a revision of it, and I'll link his channel in the description below. If you have any questions, you can just contact me in the comments, and I'll try to answer them as fast as I can. But I hope you enjoy, and good luck.